Thank you, everyone. My name is Amy Meissner. I co-chair the exhibition committee for the Surface Design Association, a membership nonprofit focused on contemporary fiber and textile art. I'm delighted to welcome you to this week's Textile Talk, The Comfort of Textiles in a Time of Need with Joe Andrews. Textile Talks webinars are brought to you by the International Quilt Museum, Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. And first, a few housekeeping announcements. This is a webinar. Your screens and mics are not showing. We welcome questions, which we'll answer at the end of the artist's presentation. So please submit them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We are honored to bring you free and inspiring Textile Talks programming and respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. Your chat comments can be seen by everyone. Please use the Q&A for questions, chat box for greeting others, and survey for commentary or ways that we can improve. If you prefer to not see notifications from the chat, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. This webinar would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. These sponsors include Moda Fabrics and Supplies, Quilting Daily, Aurifil, eQuilter.com, Artistic Artifacts, Clover, Empty Spools Seminars, Misty Fuse Attached, 9 Patch Fabrics, Quilt Mania, Schiffer Publishing, Thai Silks, and thequiltshow.com. So our presenter today is Joe Andrews. Joe is a hand weaver, but also a weaver of stories. She learned to weave while living in New Zealand and works primarily with natural fibers. Her solo exhibition called Dreaming in Color was installed at Matthew Burt's showroom in Hindon, Wiltshire. Parallel to this work, however, has been the creation of the Haptic Hue podcast. Joe's background as a TV and radio reporter for the BBC, LBC, and independent television news, as well as her travels as a global reporter, position her to find and share stories using cloth as the lens. Haptic Hue, the podcast, is now in the top 1% of podcasts globally and is listened to around the world. It has been downloaded more than 100,000 times. And it's a pleasure to welcome you, Joe Andrews.
Thank you very, very much for that. And it's a huge pleasure to be with you on a very, very rainy day. And so if you hear a great pattering of rain, then that's, I'm afraid, what the weather is here in the west of England at this stage. The comfort of textiles in a time of need. I would say these are not random thoughts, but they're very much developing thoughts. And as Amy very kindly said, I'm the host of the Haptic Hue podcast called Tales of Textiles. And what that does is to look at the different light that textiles cast on the story of humanity. Textiles are really a detective story that you can hold. They tell us a great deal about who we are as human beings. They tell us what you might believe. They tell us where people come from, and they tell us who people are. And I have a little elf in the background here who's going to change the slides. And the elf is called Astrid. And when I say next, she'll change the slide. So Astrid, next. I come from a fairly unusual background for somebody who's interested in textiles. Excuse me. For 25 years, I was a television and radio reporter. On the left, that's a picture of me on my last day as a reporter with a cameraman called Sean Swan, who I had worked with a lot. And he's actually in the Ukraine at the moment. We're there in front of a rather famous door, which I think needs no introduction. I had worked all over Europe and further afield than that, and was very used to seeing the site of refugees and sadly the site of wars. The picture on the top right is actually from Tahiti in the Pacific, and that's my car being set alight during the Tahiti riots when President Chirac decided that he was going to restart the nuclear tests at Mururoa. My car at that stage had in it my handbag, which contained $30,000 of independent television newses in cash, and my hairbrush and makeup. And when I rang the ITN news desk, they were a great deal more perturbed by the idea that my hairbrush and makeup was in the car than they appeared to be at losing the cash. Next. So I was quite used to seeing pictures of refugees, but when I started looking at the pictures of the Ukrainian refugees earlier this year, I noticed something, and either I was much more sensitized to it because I had started thinking much more deeply about textiles, or this was really the first time we'd seen this. But here's a family, they're having to flee. All they have with them are 4 plastic bags, and yet that child is taking with her the very precious little pink animal that she has. Next. What we've got here are a picture from the famous trains that left the train station in Ukraine. 2 children leaving with their mother, and the teddy bear is almost as big as they are. And we've got more children in the queues waiting to get onto the trains. And you can see these people have got very little with them, but they've remembered to bring the teddy bears with them. And I was really struck by this and wondered what was going on. These are just the things that we can see. And I think all of us who know children, have had some experience of them, will know that as well as these teddy bears and beloved toys that we can see, there will be comfort blankets and other pieces of cloth that these children have and very much rely on. Next. So I started asking the question, what do we think's going on here? And the answer came that 70% of children develop strong attachments to toys or blankets. So it's a very, very normal thing to do. And these, what they call transitional objects, help children move towards independence. I also found out that they're much more common in Western countries. And I think that's probably why we were seeing them much more in the Ukraine than we had seen them in other refugee situations. And the reason for that is that children in Western countries are expected to separate from their parents much earlier than children in other cultures. And so it's that separation, they need this comfort or this comfort blanket or the toy to take with them to give them that sense of comfort. Next. So I decided to do some research and I asked 2 now young women in positions of great responsibility. Alice is now the deputy headmistress of a school, and I had known her when she was a child, and I remembered Rugger. And so I rang her up and she very kindly sent me a picture of Rugger, who she still has. She says she doesn't use Rugger in quite the same way. And I asked her as an adult what it was about Rugger that she loved so much. And here she is. She just says it was incredibly calming and it was really comfortable. And she talks about the texture and the smell. She also says that she had to introduce Rugger to her husband and that there wouldn't have been a marriage if he hadn't accepted Rugger before they walked up the aisle. She knows where Rugger is, but she doesn't need Rugger in quite the same way. And the second research subject was Tess, who comes from New Zealand and who is now a senior journalist. Tess wouldn't show me Bida, but she would send me a picture she'd created of Bida when she was 5. But the picture says, "I love dog kisses. They are sloppy, but I really love Bida. And Tess, I remember, was absolutely inseparable from Bida. Bida was a pink check brush cotton sheet. And Tess says Bida and she had a tremendous connection, and she really loved and cared for Bida, and she worried if Bida was lost in case it got cold or scared. And interestingly, again, she doesn't need Bida now, but she still has Bida in her room and knows where Bida is. Next, please. And there's only been one piece of research that I could find that's actually been done about comfort blankets and soft toys. And that's by these two psychologists, Bristol University and Yale. And they found that children intuitively believe that comfort blankets or soft toys have a unique essence or a life force. And I love this. They know these objects aren't alive, but they believe in them as though they are. And very importantly, they can't be substituted. If you lose that item, it's gone. It's no good buying another exactly the same. It just isn't the same thing. Next. And when I started to think about this, I thought that this wasn't actually confined to childhood. Yes, children have comfort blankets. Yes, they're the ones that have the big teddies and the soft toys. But I think we comfort ourselves with textiles all our lives. And if there's no one in the moment to give you a hug, a textile is the closest we can get to replicating that. And I think those of us who make textiles, in a sense, we're also offering love and security by making and gifting textiles. Next. One of the unconscious connections here, and I think it's something we haven't consciously made the connection with, is that there is a dual meaning for the word feeling. The word starts out just meaning to feel a material or a rough surface under your fingers. And in medieval times, getting finished cloth from raw material involved so many people, and feeling was, in a sense, much more important in a pre-literate era. And so it was a much more usual thing to refer to and to talk about. And then in the 11th century, in German, Dutch, and English, it transfers over to describe our emotions, our feelings as well. And what you've got there is a rather beautiful piece of medieval marginalia of a spinner with her beautiful spindle seeing off a knight, because in those days, contrary to all the myths and legends, knights weren't quite what they were cracked up to be. They were sometimes somewhat overprivileged and took too many liberties. And here's this brave woman saying, no, I'd rather not be saved by you, please go away. Next. So I was looking for 3 examples of comfort from textiles in times of need that really involved more adult use of this. And these are just 3 examples. And I really encourage you to have a think yourselves, because I think you will come up with your own examples in your own lives. And these are just the 3 that I have come across. Either they're stories that people have told me, or they're stories that I have come across in the Haptic Hue podcasts. Next, please. So the first example of this is the extraordinary story of the Canadian Red Cross quilts. These quilts were made during World War II in Canada for refugees and displaced people in Britain and Europe. And astonishingly, 500,000 quilts were made by women's community groups across Canada. really every kind of women's group, and even school children were involved in making these quilts, and they were sent to Britain. They also went to the Netherlands, to France. They've been found in Belgium, and some were later sent to Germany. And I'm always astonished by this. Those who received them never knew who made them, and those who made them never knew who received them. And yet these were items that were absolutely loved and adored. And if you go to the next slide, this shows 3 of them. They came in all kinds of shapes and sizes. The one on the left is a sort of crazy quilt made up of bits and pieces of spare cloth that someone happened to have around. The one in the middle is what was called an Afghan, just knitted, possibly by children, with spare bits of wool that happened to be around. And the one on the right is an extraordinary one made of very, very fine dressmaking materials, silks and other beautiful organzas, fitted together absolutely perfectly by someone who was clearly a very, very skilled dressmaker. These 3 are the survivors. We know there are about 250 or 300 survivors of these quilts. They didn't survive because they were so heavily used and really absolutely loved. And if you were a bomb victim, or if you had been displaced, sometimes all you had was a quilt like this to restart your life. Next. This is Maxine March, who's chair in Britain of the Canadian Red Cross Quilt Research Group. And here's what she says about what these quilts meant to the people who received them.
Of the ones that I have received from people who were given them or whose families were given them, they were incredibly important. Of course, many of the stories come from people who were children at the time. There's a letter in the Journal of the Junior Red Cross in Canada from a little girl in an orphanage in Redhill who says that they were so excited to receive this bundle of quilts. There was one for every child in the orphanage, and the way they were distributed was the youngest child got to choose first, and then on through the ages. And she was the oldest child, so there was only one left, but she loved it. The fact that people kept them, not only the people who were given them, but the fact that the next generation down understood the emotional attachment to these, the sheer reluctance to consign them, you know, to the dump, or even give them away. I mean, many of mine have come to me by people who've said, I'm really so pleased to have found someone to give it to who understands what it means. You know, they definitely produced an emotional attachment, and I think it's even beyond the fact that somebody in a country a long way away made it. There's just something about these quilts.
Next.
Of the one.
The next category are adoption and foundling fabrics, and these are really all about fabrics that are given or passed over at a time of separation. And I began looking at this when a friend of mine told me that she had been adopted. It was an unexpected pregnancy, and she was handed over with a blanket like this. And all of her childhood, this was the only part of, in a sense, her origin story that she had. And she learned later that it was a gift from her birth grandfather. Her grandparents had fundamentally disapproved of her mother's pregnancy, and they hadn't wanted to be involved. They had arranged the adoption. Her mother had been sent away during her pregnancy and had then had to give birth a long way from home so as to avoid scandal. But her grandfather had bought a blanket and given her away with this blanket. And so she knew that this was a blanket later in life that had come to her as a present from her birth grandfather. And it's a lovely example of a textile that had changed its meaning. It started just as something which she didn't really know what it was, but it had come with her when she was adopted. And then it changed into something precious that had come from her birth grandfather. Next, please. In the same category are these extraordinary little swatches of cloth that we find in the registration books of the children who were handed over in an early orphanage in London. The same system was used in orphanages all over Europe. And remember, many of the women who couldn't care for their children, or these might have been illegitimate children, not by any means all of them were. Many of these women were not literate, but they had the hope that one day they might be able to come back and reclaim their child if their circumstances changed. And so to identify their child and to avoid having to give their name and to have any shame attached to them or their child, they left a textile token. And this is really the piece of their dress or a piece of material that they had picked out that is at the point of separation. It's the last thing that they give their child that then goes into the orphanage. Next. And this is Professor John Stiles, who's a specialist in these fabrics, and he explains why it's textiles that make so much sense in these circumstances.
Of course, textiles had one other advantage in this respect, which is that you could, unlike a letter, you could cut them in half. So you could take a length of ribbon and cut it in half, and you'd leave one half, maybe a foot, 6 inches of ribbon with the hospital, who then pinned it to the billet, to the registration document, and you would take away the other half, which you could then keep as your evidence that you had left that child on that date with the hospital. So textiles had an advantage over letters and text and paper. And actually, I think, interestingly, very often in the 18th century, that was a very widely held view. Paper is, easily lost, easily burnt, easily wetted. 18th century homes weren't exactly weatherfast a lot of the time. So paper is vulnerable in a way textiles were not vulnerable. Textiles will survive a lot of bending, folding, ripping, experiences that paper would suffer with. And so I think to do it with textiles made a lot of sense for both the hospital and the women concerned.
And if you're interested in the story of the Foundling Hospital, there is a much longer, a 38-minute podcast on that story, which I have found absolutely captivating. Next. In this category, also, I put of separation fabrics. I think that this astonishing survivor, which is a textile documented by Tia Miles in her book, All That She Carried, which is the journey of Ashley's sack, a Black family keepsake. And this was a very, very plain calico cotton sack that was handed over by a woman to her child, both of them enslaved, when the child was sold aged 9. And it was passed on down through the family. And here you can see that the grandchild of Ashley, the child that was sold, embroiders it in the 1920s. And in the book, Tia Miles actually manages to track the family right down the line. And it was a completely chance find, almost in a rummage sale, this one. But here's a fabric that, exactly as John Stiles says, survived almost everything to tell us the story down the generations. Next. And the third category is really sorrowing and grief and textiles. And I'm very, very well aware that there are different cultural uses of the clothes of the deceased. And they can be used as part of the sorrowing process, and sometimes as a way to honor them or to remember them. And in this case, these are three sisters, and there were four sisters altogether, and their father had had a long and very, very happy life, and he had died aged 96. And he was what we call in Britain a very natty dresser, and he'd had a series of absolutely lovely shirts, which his daughters had bought for him over the years. And so he's gone. He was a much loved father. And the fourth sister, Judith, decided that she would make these aprons for her three sisters out of his shirts as a way of celebrating and remembering him. Next slide. And here's Judith explaining what that meant to her.
It was very moving. So as I was making my sisters the aprons, I was thinking of my father as I sewed them, and and pictures of him in the shirts and being with him, wearing his shirts, walking into the house and seeing him there. My sisters all live fairly close together down in England, and they did get together for Christmas Day. So I'd sent a joint parcel with them in. I wanted them to open them together, and luckily they were able to. And there's a lot of humour in our family, a lot of joking, and so I think it was a mixture of being able to laugh at themselves in them, but comfort as well. Tears of both laughter and sadness.
And again, in series 2, I did look at the whole aspect of a feeling of sorrow and how textiles are used in different cultures and how they've been used, say, in South America, the apilera by South American women to mark and protest the disappeared in different cultures there, and also how they have been used to mark the Holocaust victims too. It's such a huge subject, that one. That's just a tiny, tiny snapshot. Next. So this is me trying really to pull this all together. That's a piece of my weaving at the back of this. So I think that textiles provide constant comfort for us all our lives, not just in childhood. And it's one of the reasons that duvet days are called just that, duvet days. And I think they're a substitute for, or they can be a powerful reminder of a human connection or a particular time. And what the two psychologists discovered was that for a child, it has to be that teddy bear or that piece of cloth, and no other teddy bear or no other piece of cloth will do. And when I was thinking about these three examples, I think it's exactly the same thing. You could have gone out and bought Jenny, my friend, who was adopted. You could have gone out and bought her another blanket exactly like that one, but it would not have been the same. You could have made aprons out of different kinds of shirts for Judith's sisters, but it simply wouldn't have held the emotional charge or the same kind of meaning. And so I think textiles can provide different kinds of comfort. And the other important thing is that I think the same textile can change its meaning over time as our perspective changes. And one of the examples of that is in the Foundling textiles. They start off, in a sense, by just being a piece of cloth to identify, to enable a mother and child to re-identify themselves 5, 6, 7 years later, if they're able to do that. But 250 years later, astonishingly, these registration books have become the best collection of textiles worn by everyday people rather than the textiles worn by the grand and the rich, you know, the Queen's textiles or the Bishop's textiles. And the billet books, they're called, the registration books, are now studied by people who want to know what ordinary people wore. And so these textiles have changed their meaning from being things that people used very practically to being things that give us a completely new set of information. Next. The last is a lovely quote from Helen Parrott, which is, "For all our technological sophistication, we still relate to textiles through our sense of touch, through their contact with our bodies, through memories, and through our emotions, as well as our intellects." And the last slide, I think, is the next. And that's my teddy. He's called Toffee, and I don't need to go to bed with him every night. And he's the reminder of a very happy childhood that I had. And that's Haptic Hue, Tales of Textiles. You can find it online. All of the podcasts are there. They range round the world and across textiles and making textiles and the meaning of textiles of all kinds. And Amy, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jo. Jo and I had the pleasure of meeting a little bit earlier this week, and I got a little bit of a sneak peek into what her presentation was going to be like, but it was still just as captivating to see it here a second time. And I've really been enjoying some of the comments that folks have been putting in the chat. It's obvious that a lot of people here are not only artists, makers, craftspeople, but also really interested in their own forms of research. So I have one comment and one thing that I want to share with everyone who's participating so that they know. I personally have been binging the Haptic Hue podcast and enjoying it so much. It's kind of been the soundtrack to my gardening here in Alaska, where I live, for the last week and a half or so. But one of the things that I was really excited also to learn about was on the Haptic Hue website, this really wonderful resource, which is the bookshop. That is the link to all of these wonderful books, all categorized, whether it's historical books like the one that you mentioned by Tia Miles, or other books that are world textiles. It's really a wonderful resource, and I just want to make sure that our participants are aware of it. Along those lines, I have a question for you, and I'm hoping that folks will put questions into the Q&A box. Looks like there's two, but so I'll ask mine very quickly. For those of us who feel like research and making is integrated, I can see how you, with this background in hand weaving, would be drawn to these kinds of stories. And so I can see the influence there, but I wonder about the influence going back the other direction, Jo. So for example, how is your research then influencing your creative practice?
I think it does, because I have so I think when you weave, the first two things anybody ever asks you is, they always say, how long does it take you to do that? That's the first thing anyone says, and you think, well, I don't know, I don't put a stopwatch on it. And if you're an artist, I bet you they never asked Turner or Picasso how long it took him to make that. And it's kind of they're thinking money in their heads, I think. But what my research does is it sits history at my back as I weave. And so I have a much greater sense of the heritage of what I am doing. Here's a sneak peek. There's a new podcast, and I've had my head deeply in this podcast. and it concerns velvet weaving and Renaissance velvets. And I've been weaving for some time. I think I'm a reasonably good weaver, but I had my mind blown by the hand weaving of velvet in Venice. I couldn't even comprehend what she was doing. And yeah, I am in a very small part, a very clumsy weaver compared to her. And she was weaving Stoppariso velvets, which were just exquisite silk velvets on a jacquard loom. And that's been going on since the Renaissance. How nice is it that I can sit there and think I'm doing something which has been done at least for 10,000 years.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's wonderful and resonant. So a couple of questions here. Well, one question, I think for those of us in the US, this was a new term for me as well. What are duvet days? I think I can image what a duvet day is. I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to adopt that into my vocabulary. So what are duvet days? Days when you need to stay home and snuggle? That's what the question
can't believe, perhaps that's what's wrong with America at the moment. You don't have duvet days.
We have enough duvet days.
So a duvet day is when you just, do you have duvets in America? Yes. Comforters, what do you call them? Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry.
Comforters or duvets, yeah. Same.
Yeah, so interchangeable. It's just a day when you get under the duvet and stay there and you binge watch a box set and you don't do very much and you may not get out of your pajamas or your slippers. And if you think about the days when you really relax, I think textiles are intricately involved in those. I mean, you're not going to be in your corset and your best dress.
No, so true, so true. Let's see, here is another, well, so there's a question and a comment. So Emily Hopkins comments, thank you very much for this. I am part of the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which is so fabulous. For those of you who don't know about this project, I highly encourage you to check it out. She writes, part of the Social Justice Sewing Academy, part sorrowing, part activism, another emotional component of textiles. And so true. I think textiles and social justice seem to go hand in hand, and I really appreciate this comment. And I wonder if you have anything to add to that, Jo.
Oh yes, lots. I mean, I thought the question you were going to ask me was, did the fact that I had been a political journalist influence not my textile practice, but the podcasting? And when I do the podcast, I'm sitting there looking at this thinking, I'm actually just talking about politics here, but I'm talking about it with textile eyes on. And I'm actually getting a completely different view of life. I did a podcast about samplers, and that taught me to look at samplers that working class women made because they were taught plain stitch only, because they were destined for a life of repairing other people's clothing or being a seamstress or doing these kinds of things. And the kind of samplers that Victorian women make, who were destined for a life of curating a nice home with fancy cushions and Berlin woolwork and decorations. And in Victorian times, those were the two destinations for women. And if you probably end up that as a fierce a feminist as you're ever going to be, because there wasn't a great option there. And so, yes, I think a lot of textile practice and a lot of what we think of as these textile stories they give you a very different view of both history and politics, and you hear voices that you would never hear elsewhere. And that's why I love these stories. They're fantastic tales.
Oh, I love that. That's great. So here's another question. Were children on the, were children on the kinder transports provided with some sort of comfort fabric? Is there a good resource about the use of fabric for victims of and displaced persons during the Holocaust?
No. Remember the children who came, and this is, I don't know documentation about this. The children who came on the kinder transport were not, as far as I know, provided with any sort of comfort blankets. They, of course, came often with a small suitcase of their own, so they may have come with them. And they came into host families, and some made good bonds with them, some didn't make such good bonds with them. A lot of the refugees who came into Britain were the recipients of some of these Canadian quilts. And there are some incredible stories about some of those families getting those quilts. And Maxine not only collects the quilts, she also has collected all of the stories that go with those quilts.
That's a great question.
The artist who has done a lot of work on this, I recommend her work without any hesitation, is called Karen Garfen, C-A-R-E-N and G-A-R-F-E-N. And her work on the Holocaust is really astonishing.
Sounds great. Great resource. Stephanie Vieira asks, have you looked into the relationship between fractals in nature and their healing components and how they could be translated into the fabrics of these comfort types of projects? No,
I haven't. Fibonacci sequences. I haven't looked into it. I do know about Fibonacci sequences. The National Health Service, I've been longing to do a podcast actually about mental health and working with your hands. And the National Health Service did actually do a proper scientific study about the impact that knitting has on mental health. And the result was the result that all of us would expect. Yes, knitting is really good for your mental health. And I would expect them to prescribe, instead of prescribing antidepressants, to prescribe knitting needles and balls of wool. Unfortunately, they haven't got around to doing that yet. But it's a great piece of research. And I hope others will pick it up.
That's great. Let's see. Here is another. Thank you so much, Joe. I'm a huge fan of your podcast and often listen to it while making my own textiles. This is Elena writing. Can you give us a teaser for some upcoming episodes of Haptic Hue?
Yeah. So I had the great privilege of going to Venice in March, to a Venice that was largely completely devoid of tourists. What I wanted to find out was, can the Italians still make the kind of beautiful textiles that we can see in the Renaissance painters' paintings? So you're going to have to wait to find out. So that was fun. And then tomorrow, I'm going up a creek called Mudford Creek in a tiny little rowing boat. And the reason I'm doing that is because it was a creek where a great deal of smuggling happened. And you may think this has nothing to do with textiles, but it has a great deal to do with textiles, because one of the things that was being smuggled was lace. And French lace was banned in England. I love these things. The French do it, the Dutch did it, the British did it, the Spanish did it. The governments and or the king or the queen or whoever it was just stood up and said, we will ban lace, or we will ban Indian chintz. It had no effect whatsoever, because the smugglers just set themselves up, or you know, Dutch imports would come in. And in fact, in colonial times, the Americans were allowed to have in what were called Indian chintzes, when the British weren't allowed to have them. And so the British would import them to the Americans, who would bring them back to the British so that the British could have them. So these bans never worked, but lace got banned. And so the British would smuggle it in. And this was one of the great smuggling creeks. So we're rowing up a creek to do some sounds about, I hope I don't fall in, some sounds about lace smuggling.
That's fabulous. Oh, so great. I can barely keep up with all these questions coming in. Let's see. Heather asks, 30 plus years ago, Scott Orson Card wrote a series of novels about Alvin Maker, set in the early European settlement of North America. The idea that the impulse to make or create is in all of us and is counter to forces of destruction or decay around us was central to the stories. That idea so resonated with me, inspired me as one whose fingers have been busy as long as I remember. This presentation reminded me of that and inspires me all over again. Thank you. So I guess it was a comment, not a question.
That's lovely. Thank you.
That's great.
You know, I look at there are lots of groups on Facebook and places for people who make podcasts, and the people on there are always complaining, I think you'd say, why do I never get any feedback, etc., etc. And I sit here thinking, well, I don't know why you never get any feedback. And I just thank you, all of you out there. You just send me comments, you send me feedback. You are the nicest possible audience I could ever have in the world. And you all have been since day one. So thank you.
That's great. Let's see. Anna Carlson asks, I've read Threads of Life and the things she carried. What should I read next?
I think Claire Hunter has a new book out, which is about Mary, Queen of Scots. So I would certainly, and then the name of it has slipped from my brain, I would certainly have a, excuse me, a read of that. On my newsletter, I have a book of the month every month, and there are some quite good picks there. What have I been reading this? Oh, I love The Sewing Machine by Natalie Fergie. That was a really good read. I think Claire Hunter's book Threads of Life, though, is an absolute winner. It's very hard to get as good as that. So I would read Claire Hunter's second book.
Let's see, Cynthia says, it feels as though there is a shift towards more fiber handwork, mending, knitting, etc. in Western cultures, and away from fast fashion, thankfully. Do you think that change will influence the meaning and importance of textiles for us in a way that resembles some of the examples from the past that you mentioned?
I hope so. I think, and again, it's something I would love to do a podcast on, but I think it's just a huge subject and I want to be able to do it justice. The whole idea of fast fashion and disposable fashion, and watching, even knowing what happens to the garments that we give to charity shops, where frankly they end up being dumped on beaches in Africa or ending up in huge burning piles in very poor countries. It's horrific. And somehow that chain has to be broken. And I think, yes, we do value textiles more, but I think we're still a tiny minority. And I think part of the problem is kind of greenwashing by the firms that churn this stuff over, by saying, you know, oh, bring your clothes back, we'll give you a discount on the new clothes, where really what you want is, no, you buy better quality, keep it for longer, and don't buy so much. I think there is a whole generation of people who will now perhaps buy less, but whether it's going to have a real impact and whether we've reached sort of peak clothing buying, I don't know. Maybe the difficulties with supply lines will mean that we have. But again, I mean, there are people say to me, where do you get your stories? And I just think I'm drowning in stories. You know, there are just so many stories out there which have never been properly told.
Or they're told by a point of view that is one of power.
Yes, and it's important to me to tell the stories and to listen or hear the voices of those who don't have power. And I hope that's what Haptic Hue can do at its best. Sometimes it doesn't succeed.
Well, I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
And Sally Hudson asks, have you ever considered writing a book about textiles? It would be brilliant.
Thank you. The answer is yes, but the next bit is, where do I find the time? So it's either the podcast or it's the book. So I think I'd have to stop the podcast for a year to write a book. I'd love to write a book. And in fact, I'd love to write a book on this whole issue of emotions and textiles, because I think that's territory where I'm sure everyone listening knows this connection. We know it here, but it's not, it hasn't been talked about and actually put down on paper in quite the same way. And I think it's time that it was.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of research done around mental health, and certainly how to use craft and art as forms of therapy. But, you know, in the hierarchy of the senses, touch is down at the bottom, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Our visual sense is at the top, and touch and taste are way down at the bottom. And so, so that's something that definitely could be explored more.
I think taste has gone. It's partly to do with literacy. If you go back to a pre-literate age, then people privilege other senses much more. But because we're literate, then sight obviously becomes dominant, and our hearing is also incredibly important. And touch has become very diminished as a sense that we use. And it's one of the five senses, and yet we don't, we just ignore it a lot of the time. And it tells us so much.
It does. And for those of us who have a really hard time walking into a museum, we have to jam our hands into our pockets so that we don't touch everything and flip things over and look at the backside. I mean, that's how I take in a lot of information about whether it's garments or textiles or anything that's haptic, right? Anything that's been made by hand. And so, yeah, I think a lot of us can relate. So there is, let's see, 2 more questions, and then I think we're coming really close to the end here. So Susan writes, this is such a deep and inspiring conversation. Thank you. Oh, this is a question for me. Maybe the image behind you is so intriguing. A painting. Yes, it is a painting behind me. This is a painting done by Indigenous painter Linda Lyons, and she explores the intersection between colonization and indigeneity. And so this is, she has done a whole series of icon paintings with these really beautiful landscapes and Indigenous women, and they are all holding animals. So this is actually a sea otter that this icon is holding. And that is the part of Alaska where she is from. That is very much what it looks like in real life, which is kind of unbelievable. Let's see. So last question here from Sally Hudson. Do you think gender has anything to do with the connection? Do women feel the connection with textiles more?
Yes, I think they do. I would say about 85% of the people, maybe 90% of the people who listen to Haptic Hue are women. And in the modern age, definitely it is women who work with textiles and appreciate them much more. You can explain this to men, and they do get it. And there are a small percentage of men who do listen to Haptic Hue and who like the stories and who are involved in textiles and take weaving courses. But I think for various reasons, women have remained closer to this. Of course, in times gone by, it was men who were the weavers and who were the dyers and who were involved in all of these textile processes. It's just as machines have taken over and the age of industrialization took over, it became women who have kept this alive and kept this going and kept these skills going down the generations. In Italy, at the Velvet Weavers, all of the weavers were women. In medieval times, the women were not permitted to weave these complex velvets in the Renaissance. Only the men were allowed to weave them. Now, only the women weave them. So these things change. But for keeping these things alive, for keeping this heritage alive, it's been down to women. I mean, without women, hand weaving would have gone completely. And spinning has always been entirely an occupation of women. So yes.
Let's see, the questions keep coming, but I'm going to have to trim it a little bit here. Tamara asks, have you heard of any research into personal textiles of workhouse residents in Victorian England?
There are some. Workhouse residents are quite difficult. There are orphanages. So there are, I did a podcast about samplers and it starts with orphanage samplers. It wasn't quite a workhouse. I think workhouses were made to produce textiles. I would doubt that textiles that were worn by those in workhouses have really survived. We do have textiles, and you have some in America, that survive from early mental hospitals with mental patients. And some of them are artistically quite stunning. And again, something I would love to make a podcast on. I've been tracking actually some of the jackets, I think, that were made by a woman in a 19th century mental hospital in America, and one made, or a couple of fabrics made by a woman in a mental hospital in Norfolk in Britain. Beautiful, beautiful work, and kept, and they're survivors. So workhouses I don't know about. I would only know about plain stitching and teaching them samplers.
Amazing. I'm remembering a jacket. You said jacket, and if it's the one I'm thinking of, it's covered in
That's
text.
it.
It's like a diary. I mean, it was just, and
Yeah, it's so beautiful.
It's so gorgeous. So powerful and so moving.
And one of the fantastic things in those times, which I learned, is that women were often not taught to write, but they were taught to stitch, and they could stitch their letters, so they could write, they could sew a story, but they could not write a story. And so there's a fantastic piece of work where a young girl who's a servant, it's in the V&A Museum in London, and she basically talks of a sexual assault that happens, and she has a mental breakdown as a result of it, and she comes home and she stitches the terrible story of this in most beautiful cross stitch, and she starts this sampler by saying, "As I cannot write."
Mm-hmm.
And she then stitches it. And so these in Victorian Britain, it was thought wrong to teach women to write, not to read. They could read, but they could sew. And so to her, sewing came more naturally than writing. I found that an insight that was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating and stunning. So we are just a little bit after the hour. I think most of us could probably sit here and listen to you speak, Joe, for the rest of the day. But I'm going to go ahead and thank you so much for your time. And
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Pleasure. And we get to continue hearing your voice through our earbuds as we garden, as we drive down the road, as we cook dinner, as we sew, through the Haptic and Hue podcasts.
And let me know if you have any great ideas.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I have a question too about your bookshop. My understanding is that you are also taking suggestions if people have thoughts on books and titles that you...
Please, absolutely. There's a US bookshop and a UK bookshop, since apparently never the twain shall meet.
So yes, I would tell folks to drop you a line and
yep. Contact at hapticandhue.com. Any ideas, any books. I give textile presents away with every podcast, which anyone who's signed up for the newsletter knows about. So, and there's always one reserved for this North American time zone, so you don't have to worry about being in competition with all those early wakers in the rest of the world.
Well, this is great. So I have just a few closing remarks. Not only thanking Joe, but certainly thanking our sponsors, and to SAQA for hosting us today. So we invite you to visit SDA's website for more information about our wonderful Surface Design Association journal, our programs and exhibitions, and to join and support our organization. The recording for the Comfort in a Time of Need will be available on YouTube in the next week. Next Wednesday, Textile Talks hosts conversations with the artists, gastronomy, the exhibition, which is sponsored by Studio Art Quilt Associates. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day. These questions and comments were wonderful. So wherever you are, enjoy.